So today we are going to be talking about science fiction novels, but in particular science fiction novels that have sort of a philosophical bent to them. I'm really interested in this idea that we can use science fiction and actually just fiction in general to explore philosophical ideas. You know, I'm a philosopher by training, but I love to read, and I want to think about how we can use some of these texts to maybe think about philosophy. So I decided to pick what I think are some of the best works of philosophical science fiction. There are many books that should make it onto a list like this if I were aiming to be exhaustive, but I just tried to pick what I think are just some really solid, excellent books for you. So let's dive right in. I think it makes sense to start a list like this with Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Huxley is often contrasted with Orwell, where Orwell imagined a totalitarian state emerging. Huxley thought that the totalitarianism would not come through force, but rather almost through our own consent. We would want to live in a world where we had no real choices. And that's because he thought that we could either be bred in a certain way, which we see in the hierarchy of society with the alphas, the betas, the gammas, and so on, but also that we would just be overrun with pleasure, that we would decide that it was just better for us if we were only concerned with pleasure. And to live in this kind of world. So Aldous Huxley masterfully introduces this outsider character of John, who has values that are actually much closer to our own, and he's able to see the inauthenticity of the society in which he kind of is brought into actually as an adult after he's discovered, essentially. I'm not going to talk about 1984 in this video, though you obviously could. I'll just note this. Orwell is kind of like the default political reference, at least in American politics, for some good reasons. But I honestly think that the more prescient writer of the two was Aldous Huxley. I think really, if you want to understand how like entertainment and the media and social media and technology kind of all come together to rob us of meaning, Huxley is really the much better writer. And I even think when you're thinking of themes of totalitarianism or themes of sort of the world at large coming away from the individual, say, Huxley's the man. I like basically everything by Orwell I've ever read. I love Politics in the English Language. That is a great essay, but for my money, this is the better book. Hey, and by the way, you might have noticed that in some of the footage that I'm showing you in this video, I have a different desk than usual, and that's because FlexiSpot is sponsoring this video and sent me that desk. FlexiSpot is a standing desk company. They make highly affordable desks that can come in a variety of sizes. You can pick your size, you can pick your color. Many of them have different kinds of features like built-in charging. I chose a fairly stripped down model. It has a nice bamboo top and just adjusts going to a sitting or standing position. I like to use a standing desk, particularly when I need to move around a bit as I'm working. I found that it helps my back if I'm not sitting too long, especially hunched over, as I have rather bad posture. And I really like the fact that my desk has a number of settings, so I don't have to calibrate it perfectly each time. I can just calibrate it perfectly once, and it will remember the settings for good. There is a worry that you will hear about certain standing desks that if you buy ones that are too affordable, let's say, that they can actually be rather unsturdy and kind of shaky. My desk is very sturdy. I feel very confident using it. I set up a camera for top-down shots, and I need that camera to not shake, and I found that it does a really nice job there. It's actually doing a better job than my previous desk, which was more expensive. So thank you, FlexiSpot, for sponsoring this video. And if you're interested in finding a new desk, you can find a link down in the description. The second book is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. Ishiguro is probably most famous for a book called Never Let Me Go. And I think that some of the themes that you would find in Never Let Me Go can also be found in Klara and the Sun. Just spoiler alert in case you're worried, but in Never Let Me Go, what you see is that a whole batch of people, these clones essentially, have been created to serve as organ transplants, and they're raised apart from the rest of the world, and then they go off eventually to be essentially harvested for their organs. And so we see it through their eyes, where they're clearly human, they clearly have souls, they clearly are one of us, and yet we dehumanize them, we use them purely to prolong our own lives. In Klara and the Sun, Ishiguro is tackling some of those same themes. There are two ways that we see this, though. One is in the character of Klara and sort of her ilk, which are essentially companion robots for mostly fairly wealthy children. Klara is what they call an artificial friend in this book. She clearly has feelings. She's capable of emotion and cognition, and so you might think that she's kind of a stand-in or playing a similar role to the people who are being cloned in Never Let Me Go. But there's also this other case about human enhancement. Children of a certain economic class are lifted, as they put it in this book, and while this gives them heightened mental abilities and intelligence, this also leads to health problems and can actually lead to their death. Ishiguro seems fascinated by the theme of the degradation of the human person, and also what philosopher Peter Singer has called the moral circle, meaning who do we expand our moral consideration to? You might imagine for the egoist, it's just us, and then for some people, it's just us and our family, or our friends, or our wider community, the whole world, or the non-human persons, like certain kinds of animals, or the animal world, etc. And Ishiguro, I think, is really putting some of that stuff into stark relief in his fiction. This was a book that I listened to as an audiobook, by the way, and I can't remember the name of the narrator. Maybe I'll put that below, but I thought the narrator did a really great job. Next, let's talk about Octavia Butler. I've tried to make videos about Butler before, and I've never ended up releasing them because I've never been super happy with them, but I want to talk about her. This is Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower, which are a little duology. I think they're great. I also really like Dawn, which is part of the Lilith's Brood trilogy. I think those are also great. Butler was capable of writing in many different kinds of settings, and for that reason, I think she's probably in the top 3, certainly at least top 5 science fiction writers of the 20th century. Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower, though, they are kind of low science fiction in the sense they're kind of soft science fiction. It's set in sort of a near future dystopia, and for that reason we would classify it as science fiction. And there are certain sort of technological advances that have occurred. But really the value for Butler, and I see this across all of her works, is I think that Butler is like the master of psychologically real characters. I think that if you want to understand moral decision making or sometimes themes of consent or autonomy or the individual, Butler's able to show you the complexities and nuances and difficulties of all of these concepts in a highly personal way. And that's one of the great things about trying to think philosophically while reading science fiction, I think, or reading literature in general, is that we get to see it sort of personified and exemplified. And that is Butler's great strength. It's the psychological reality of her characters. The next series that I want to talk about is the Remembrance of Earth's Past series by Cixin Liu. Begins with the 3-body problem, and then there's the Dark Forest, and then there's Death's End. Cixin Liu is a great writer. I think there's lots of really great science fiction coming out of China as well. Liu is writing what is essentially a first contact story, but then we get to see basically first contact through all of its impact on human history for just a massive timeline. If I say any details, maybe I'm going to ruin a little bit too much of the story if you haven't read it. But if you're reading this sort of looking for those philosophical themes, the things that I think Liu really explores very, very well, especially in the Dark Forest and onward, because it just the story just gets so much more complex and interesting in the Dark Forest. It's basically like making moral decisions in extreme circumstance. The very first scene in this series is set during the Cultural Revolution in China. We see people who were overtaken by zeal and emotion in a very scary time in China's history. And we see the same level of intensity throughout the entire story. People who start to think that maybe morality needs to be suspended due to the circumstances. There are considerations about what we owe to each other. There are considerations about what we might owe to non-human persons and what they might owe to us. There are also considerations about survival and the sort of the dark logic of dealing with the unknown. This really becomes clear in the Dark Forest. We essentially discover in that book that the entire universe is governed by this principle that you must kill before you can be killed, especially when we're operating at an interplanetary scale. And so sort of 2 strategies emerge in the universe. One is to destroy other civilizations as soon as you discover them, and that way you are actually preventing them from destroying you. And another way is to hide yourself as much as possible and sort of permanently cut yourself off from the universe. I have had long discussions of this book with several friends from graduate school. So several philosophers just sitting around talking about some of the particular dilemmas that you would face if you were in the world of the 3-body problem. And finally, I want to talk about my favorite science fiction writer pretty much ever. One of my top 3 or 5 writers, definitely, and that is Ursula K. Le Guin, and particularly talking about her Hainish Cycle of stories. The Hainish Cycle includes The Dispossessed, The Left Hand of Darkness, The Word for World is Forest. All of these books are tremendous and terrific. So much of science fiction is basically a big what if. So it says, what would happen if, And then that if can be kind of super interesting and complicated. One living writer who I think does a good job with these sort of very long, prolonged what ifs would be Adrian Tchaikovsky. His book Children of Time could have made a list like this. But his tend to go like pretty detailed and kind of what if, and then he imagines these big, big changes to the world. Le Guin, though, almost imagines these kind of tiny changes. So in The Left Hand of Darkness, we're saying, what would it be like to live in a world in which there was no sexual differentiation between human beings, and the sexual role that you took on was just a matter of context? And so what would that say about sex and gender and perception, right? Like that's a big theme to address, but it's kind of just what if, there was no sex, basically. That's the kind of question Le Guin is asking. Or in The Dispossessed, it's basically like, what if the anarchists got their way for a little while and they tried to live in a certain way? And these are anarchists in a very peaceful variety. And Le Guin can just kind of unpack those themes. She can then integrate them into a very interesting story that often has a lot of like political complexity to it, which is great. She's very tasteful. And so every Le Guin book becomes an exploration of just an initially truly interesting idea. And that idea should be enough to grip you and to give you more to think about. But here's the real beauty of someone like Le Guin. Le Guin doesn't actually give you hard answers. So she usually leaves you in a kind of unresolved place. That is, she has not tried to give the easy answer to any of the difficult questions that she has posed. So these are books that definitely can be reread, and these are books that should have you thinking for weeks or months or even years after you've read them. And that is the mark of what I would say is like truly great philosophical science fiction. And I think Le Guin does that better than anyone else on this list.